Welcome everyone to the qualitative research session. Louis and Sanjay have been instrumental in organizing this workshop, which will provide faculty and doctoral students with practical tips on how to navigate qualitative research projects from initial idea to successful implementation. Louis is a professor of management and entrepreneurship at Nazarene College and California State University, Northridge. And Sanjay Jain is a professor at California State University, Northridge. And we have three esteemed panelists. I'll let Louis and Sanjay introduce them to you. So Louis and Sanjay, please take over. Thank you.
Okay, one sec. Let me just open up my share screen and hang on a sec. Get my slides up. Okay, one sec. All right.
Sanjay, we can't see your screen.
Yeah, one sec. Okay, here we go. Can you guys see my slides?
Yes, yes. We do.
All right. So first of all, a very warm welcome to this reimagined version of the CEEC. My name is Sanjay Jain, and I, along with Lois Shelton, are the organizers of this. We're the two organizers for this session. Our objective today is to introduce you to the world of qualitative research, and especially as it applies to studying entrepreneurial phenomena, okay? And by qualitative research, we are talking about a wide variety of research traditions that allow for an interpretive kind of understanding of phenomena. And so from narratives, from numbers, we're moving to narratives. From statistics, we're moving to stories, okay? And just a couple of quick observations. Publishing qualitative research is a high risk, high reward kind of endeavor. And I'll explain what I mean by that. It's high risk in the sense that by no means is it the dominant form of research in our journals. You have a small, maybe about 10 to 20% of articles that get published being qualitative in nature across the kind of key entrepreneurship journals. Having said that, it's high reward in the sense that a number of the papers that do get published are very influential in the field. And just as an example in entrepreneurship, Ted Baker's piece from now about a decade ago, or actually 15 years ago, on bricolage has been one of the most influential papers in entrepreneurship, I think, over this period of time. The other, positive signs in terms of qualitative research is that, both thematically and practically, there is now a larger number of scholars kind of working and using qualitative methods. And most of the journals have, folks who can handle qualitative papers appropriately. This was not the case, I would say, 10 years ago, but now at every journal, you seem to have at least half a dozen folks, who can serve as editors and as reviewers and give useful feedback to qualitative papers. And of course, I think, qualitative research lends itself very well to studying emergent phenomena. And so from a thematic viewpoint, if we think of entrepreneurship and innovation as emergent phenomena, qualitative research offers a very kind of useful methodological lens to study this. And one of the things I'd like to kind of introduce is qualitative research as scrupulous storytelling. Scrupulous, here I mean meticulous kind of storytelling. So, we've all had some extra time, I suspect, on our hands. And with a little bit of that time, I was watching a few nights ago, All the President's Men, the movie about the Watergate scandal. And that is a really, fine example of investigative reporting. And what we're going to do is introduce to you three really good academic and investigative reporters. And so the participants for our session today are Bruce Teague from Eastern Washington University, Chad Navis from Clemson University, and Rene Rotner from UC Santa Barbara, each of whom have published in top entrepreneurship and management journals, qualitative pieces, and have, I think, really interesting journeys to share with you this morning. So in terms of our agenda, our plan is to kind of, after I'm done, switch it across to our three speakers. And each one of them will kind of reflect on their journey and also talk a little bit about tips and tricks of doing qualitative research. And each one, we've asked them to do this in about 13 minutes plus or minus a little time. And so about 40 minutes in their presentations. And then towards the end of the session, we'll have Q&A from the audience through chat, okay? And just before moving, I just want to introduce you to a resource that I was involved with just a couple of years ago. And so we put together a book called the Routledge Companion to Qualitative Research and Organization Studies. Some of you might find this useful. It has about 35 chapters, from qualitative research experts across the organization's discipline, including entrepreneurship. So having said that, let me pass it on to Bruce, and he will talk about his experiences, and some tips and tricks about doing qualitative research. All right. Thanks a lot.
Do I have the screen now?
You got to stop sharing, Sanjay, and
okay. Let me.
And Bruce, please put it in presentation mode, the full screen when you make the presentation. Thank you.
It says, okay, stop share. Okay.
Yeah, stop share.
Okay, I'm done.
Okay. So let me get this set up real quick to run for us. Okay, so welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I hope we can add something to this. I certainly appreciate Lois and Sanjay for inviting me in to participate with this topic. I think it's really important these days. Some background on me. My primary interests are the study of entrepreneurial behavior, entrepreneurship as practice. So I've co-founded the Entrepreneurship as Practice scholarly community. And for those of you who are interested in qualitative research and publishing entrepreneurship qualitative research, entrepreneurship as practice is a really great opportunity that has been emerging. The practice area has been emerging across the Academy of Management. Strategy as practice scholars have really been breaking down some of the doors for us in the major journals in terms of qualitative publishing as well. So that can be a real opportunity. We do hold an annual conference at the end of March, early April each year. Obviously, this year we had to cancel.
Bruce, can you please share your screen?
I thought I was.
No,
is my screen not up?
No.
I was showing screen share.
No, we don't see your screen.
Okay, let me try again. Wait, hang on. Okay, now do you have it?
Yeah, yes, we do have it now. Thank you.
Okay, so let's try again on that front.
Slideshow.
Okay, so and you can contact me for information about the conference, but next year we intend to be in Amsterdam, and that is focused on qualitative research, and typically about 100 scholars, including PhD students, working on that. And then I'm also interested in the development of entrepreneurial expertise. Bill Gartner and I have just published a book, a research handbook on entrepreneurial behavior, practice, and process that is focused on qualitative inquiry into these three areas. And it brings together, much like what Sanjay was just talking about a minute ago, a lot of scholars who've been really successful publishing in the area of qualitative research, people like Dimo Dimov, Denise Fletcher, Bengt Johannesson, and so can be a reference there. It can also be an introduction to the practice, entrepreneurship as practice side of things. In terms of the project that I'm going to be talking about today, we were each asked to talk about one of our recent projects. I just recently published an article in Entrepreneurship and Regional Development, And that was based on 28 months in the field studying pitching to angel investors. And the theoretical lens for this is social practice theory. This is an entrepreneurship as practice piece. And the goal is to understand the practice of pitching to angels as it occurred within this organizational or practice context. And I should probably share that one of the motivations for this was a feeling of dissatisfaction with the accepted assumptions in the broader literature. There has traditionally been a very transactional set of implicit assumptions to the notion of pitching, that it is, I pitch, you give me money. And we found that that really isn't a very satisfactory explanation for what happens in these practice contexts. Our team was made up of myself, David Gordon. The two of us were in the field sites. And then we had a third counterpart, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit as we go into our tips, who intentionally was kept out of the field as a counterpoint when we were looking at interpreting through a research lens to make sure that we didn't become too integrated as insiders. We spent 28 months in our primary field site, 46 hours of direct observation, 55 pitches were observed, attended 26 meetings of related organizations, so another 37 hours of observation there, 41 additional follow-up interviews, 19 hours and 34 total minutes there. So as you can see, this is time consuming. It is a work of passion and it is a work of building relationships. But as Sanjay said, once you've made that investment, it really does start paying off on the back end. It's not a single slice type of thing. You build up relationships and observation points. Our key takeaways in this study was we found that pitching is actually better understood through a longitudinal relational lens. What I mean by that is we found that there was multiple types of pitches that had not been addressed in the literature or not recognized that were part of a long-term developing and evolving relationship with the investment organization itself, with the angel organization. And so we identified developmental pitches, pre-investment pitches, which are surprisingly common, investment pitches, and then update pitches. So in looking at this, what we found was it cycled. Not everybody went through developmental pitches, but some really early stage entrepreneurs were brought in essentially to practice in the environment, to learn the expectations and the norms of the practice. Pre-investment pitches were surprisingly common. And pre-investment pitches were companies typically that were expecting to come back and make an ask for investment within about 6 to 9 months. And they explicitly came out and announced that they were not looking for investment at that point in time. But what it allowed them to do was, without upsetting investors or triggering due diligence processes, it allowed them to find where the pushback points were in their business model and to address them before they came back to invest. Whether they started at pre-investment or came in at investment, the investment pitch was aimed at raising money, and they had specific raises that they were looking at and equity offsets that they were offering. And then what we found also was that it was surprisingly common that companies that had been invested in came back and updated the angel community on how things were going with that company, with that investment. And we found that that served a couple of purposes. One, it allowed those companies to retain a relationship on an ongoing basis with the investment community in case they needed to come back in and raise again. But it also allowed the angel community to, in essence, highlight successes of investment and to add a legitimacy to their organization by default by highlighting these successes. So that's where I'm going to end with my specific project. I don't want to overuse time, so I'm going to move into the tips and tricks session. And then anybody that has specific questions, I'm more than happy to talk separately on that one with you. So do you have my tips and tricks up right now? Can everybody see that? No?
No, you got to pull
Right.
them up. You got to. Stop the screen share and reshare your new slide.
Okay. Zoom control. Oh. And they're wonderful tips, I'm promising. Sorry, folks, I am having trouble getting my control panel up.
Okay. If you just try to.
So I'm just going to go ahead and skip the slides and go into the questions, if that's all right, because I'm having trouble getting my control panel to come back up. Oh, let's see. Oh, let's see if I've got it now. Does that give it to you?
No.
No. Okay. Anyhow, we were sent questions to address tips and tricks. One of them was what types of questions are appropriately addressed by qualitative research designs. My suggestion would be that it's questions in which the goal is to develop a deep understanding of one or more specific interesting cases. Questions that involve how individuals experience their realities. Questions in which observational subjects may be working with tacit knowledge and may not be able to communicate the nuance of their setting or their experience in the way that we need. Questions in which subjects may not even be attending to how the environment shapes behavior, such as power relations and materiality of spaces, things like that, the taken for granted. Questions in which findings are based upon assumptions that have not been adequately tested, as with our recent paper. Questions in which new theory is required, and studies in which the goal is deep understanding of a case that does not conform to accepted theories. In terms of the second question I was presented with, and Lois and Sanjay did a wonderful job with this, it was what are the key characteristics of qualitative research questions and how do they differ from quantitative research questions? And over the last 5 years of evaluating proposals for Entrepreneurship as Practice Conference, we see patterns come up frequently dealing with exactly this question, so it's a great one. Qualitative questions are interested in deep understanding of one or more of a few related cases. They seek new understanding. They seek to understand experience from the perspective of the participants, and they typically are theory building or refining questions. Quantitative questions are those that are interested in theory testing. So questions that examine the prevalence of a finding or the broad relationship between established variables. So how regular is something? So for instance, with our paper, if we wanted to ask the question, how frequently are the 4 types of pitch that we observed found in other angel organizations, that would be a quantitative study by design. Questions about how generalizable a conclusion or theory may be, and questions about what is generally true as opposed to what is true in this case. And somebody's got my slides up for me, thank you. Can we advance to that next one? And the third question was, what are some key features of qualitative research projects you should consider before embarking on them? I would say the first thing is, what is it that you want to understand? What kinds of questions interest you? And avoid research that simply confirms that a site looks exactly like what theory says it should. And that may sound obvious, but it's surprisingly common in the submissions that we see. Do you have the time and patience for field research? It's not a 20-minute expedition into an interview. It is a big time investment, but it has a big payoff on the back end. Can you afford to invest the time in your field sites required to develop access and the relationships that are going to help you? Here's a big one. What are you going to give back to the site? It is a relationship, and you're going to get better access if you're contributing as well. Where do you want or need to publish? Different journals are more or less receptive. That said, it really helps if you communicate to the editor how you are participating in or advancing a conversation that is occurring in their journal. And too often authors forget to do that. Who do you want to talk to in the literature? Who is it you're having a conversation with? What kind of conversation do they have? How often will you record and interact with your data? You've got to have a plan because you have to get it down, but you're so frequently engaged with the field that there has to be that time where you record your data and deal with it and reflect and come back to the field. How will you counterbalance the tendency to become an insider? A lot of people phrase this as going native, but to me, when you begin participating in a site, there is a tendency to become an insider to that group, and it can cause you to start taking for granted assumptions of the group. In our case, we used an explicit outsider as a member of our team, and how well you organize and present your data in a convincing manner for reviewers, because you've got to make this believable for people in order to move it through the publishing chain. So those are my tips and tricks.
Thanks a lot, Bruce, for some wonderful insights. Let's kind of move it on to Chad. Chad, do you want to take it on?
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Actually, I like coming right off of Bruce's heels here because my research is a little bit different in the sense that I do qualitative research of archival data in a lot of ways. But you can see a lot of common patterns and everything he speaks to in terms of the types of questions we ask, and our approach is very similar, but with a different data source. So for my time, what I wanted to do is take a bit of a 30,000-foot view of a current research project that my colleagues and I have been working on, sadly, for many years now, but we're actually getting really close to the finish line on this one. I think by the end of the summer, this will be ready to submit to a journal. But I wanted to walk through really the anatomy of this project from a high-level view, starting with the research question, and focus on kind of how that relates to our objective, which is to develop a general framework of market category non-emergence. So we're effectively using evidence from our case to help, as Bruce described, develop and extend theory around market category non-emergence and how that relates to some of our research design choices. So just breaking apart our research question a bit, it's a how question, right? How do new market categories fail to emerge, which suggests we're interested in developing a deeper understanding of something, a process, and providing explanation, understanding the mechanisms versus, in comparison, a variance study where we'd be interested in prediction or causality, which is not our focus here. The second part of the research question is new market categories. That's our theoretical frame, effectively. That's what we're interested in explaining. And again, to Bruce's points, that's our conversation we're contributing to. And part of that is there's an existing conversation of what we know, and that when market categories emerge, there's an aspect of what we know what that should look like. They should be stable, have a pretty clear label, a clear understanding of what the boundaries are, what the criteria are for members to be part of that category or not, and certain meanings that become stabilized, which we need to leverage in the study. But what we're really interested in understanding, again, as Bruce said, is not to replicate what we know, but to provide a novel explanation. So in our case, we're interested in exploring contestation among stakeholders. So if we're interested in this lack of stabilization, how does that come about, and why does that matter when you think about how different stakeholders interact in a new space? So the next part of the research question is failed to, right? So we're interested in a failed case versus a successful one. And by failure, we define that specifically related to our construct of what a successful category should look like, as I was just speaking to. And then emerge, it's a temporal question, right? How does this play out over time? Presumably, it may be the case that over time, there's qualitative differences in how this space unfolds, this market space unfolds that we want to attend to, and that's actually part of the story that matters. So with that, if we're interested in non-emergence, we need to start with a case where we probably should have expected that at least had the potential to emerge. And we're looking at the US online grocery market around the .com boom and bust time period. And that creates certain opportunities as well as challenges. And what we really where we start out is that there's a lot of reasons. There were certainly a lot of headwinds in this space. This is the time, if you remember, Webban and Home Grocer and Peapod, et cetera. But we can rule out that at least certain explanations don't fully tell the story. So the technology actually worked pretty well. There was a lot of publicity and acclaim for this. It was expected to do really well. When we look at actually the on-the-ground metrics for customer recruitment and retention, they're actually pretty favorable. And one of the things that largely gets sort of dismissed when you see how the narrative of this space was rewritten over time was that these firms that were involved in this were largely meeting and often surpassing the milestones that were their initial expectations that they set out with their investors. And then we actually see evidence that this was profitable and actually quite viable, both through archival evidence and some conversations with the founders of these firms that were really frustrated that the plug got pulled on the space too soon, because they could make a strong case within their operations. This could have been really what Amazon is today much sooner had they been given more time. And what happened is they weren't given time. So that, in terms of the pure explanation, investors pulled the plug on this space around the fourth quarter of 2000. We know that's what happened, but we want to understand why, beyond some of the existing headwinds. So our focus is to take a deep dive into that shaded area, but we also know we're looking at just one case, and there's a lot of other things that happen. So we look at these counterfactuals that we use to really supplement our analysis. So at the same time, there were several market categories that did successfully emerge. US or online groceries in the UK, for instance, Amazon.com, which at that point was a bookstore, right? An online bookstore. Certain other markets. We can look at Instacart today to help inform our theorizing at the end. And I'm using these as exemplars, to represent online groceries today. And so we come back to those later in the paper, but because if we try to address this too much on the front end, it complicates our story. But diving into this a little bit, so we look into this question, we're interested in contestation. So if we're interested in understanding contestation among stakeholders, we have to ask ourselves which stakeholders matter. And here we draw on theory. We're looking at the entrepreneurial firms, so kind of the key players, the incumbent firms from related industries, the grocers, looking at how security analysts are talking about and making sense of and giving meaning to this space, along with the technology journalists as well. We collect data on all these different actors. You can see it actually works out as you might expect in a normal distribution over this time period, which gives us some assurances that we're capturing the full story in terms of at least this piece of it that we're looking at in this study. There's an element of what we actually spent a lot of time in our analysis in establishing that these meanings didn't stabilize in the category. But these are structural findings to show that the labels didn't stabilize. They actually diverged over time. People increasingly called this different things, and it actually took more of an e-grocer type referent versus something that related to groceries. And we established that's a part of the story, but that's not the main finding, because again, this speaks to what we'd expect to happen based on prior research. We're just establishing that at least the way we define the category, it didn't emerge as you would expect. What we're really interested in understanding again is why, and why are the explanations that we're offering important above and beyond what we already know today. And for that, we adopt more of the traditional qualitative approach that you might be more familiar with. So we take all this data, we understand how it plays out over time, so we have a good understanding what happened in this case. We temporally bracket this into two periods. For us, this was a period where there's really a lot of hype and a lot of real threat rigidity reaction to it. And we're interested in coding among these different stakeholders. What are they claiming? What can we get a sense of their expressed interest? How does that manifest in what they're saying and their actions? And from that, we try to understand themes for what's happening. And we look at those themes within stakeholders, but we also want to understand how those themes relate to what the stakeholders are saying in relation to other stakeholders, as well as the broader cultural context, which in our case, again, is the dot-com boom and bust. Overall, with the goal of course, answering our research question, including how, when, and why this contestation that we're trying to understand might actually hinder meaning formation, and why that matters for category failure. And ultimately, in this case, why did it explain why investors pulled the plug when we actually have pretty good evidence that had they continued to fund it longer, maybe it would have stood a chance. So I won't go into the details of this. This graphic here is going to be completely revamped. But ultimately, we want a general framework that's not specific to our case. But in general, what we're finding is in the early period, the actions of all these different actors, rather than contributing to meaning stabilization, are actually severing these meanings. So entrepreneurial firms are not only distancing themselves from the incumbents and the meanings in the grocery space, but also from each other. They're really talking about this in incompatible ways. The intermediaries are sort of pushing for kind of broader, ambiguous definitions of the space, whereas whereas a clear, kind of more concrete subcategory definition would be a little easier to get your mind around in some ways. Ultimately, the category, there's a break, right? And things begin to dissolve. And we find later on that the firms, basically everyone's best efforts contribute to a downward spiral that is largely irreversible. As firms are pushed to scale back, they actually look worse. The category itself gets questioned more. The marketing, the grocers talk about how this is an abject failure and create a narrative that in some ways is really difficult to recover from. It's a bit more, it's a kind of a complex story that's hard to summarize in a short period. But that's the challenge of this kind of research too, right? The story's there, it's complex, and distilling into a coherent narrative, which I think Renee is going to speak to a little bit, is one of the big challenges. But that's where we're going with this. Wish I could actually spend a lot of time on that. Ultimately, we're not focused on proving something, but trying to provide robust and highly transparent evidence from our case. It's enhanced by explicit consideration of counterfactuals. What are the boundary conditions that we need to raise and be mindful of? And how do we reconcile our new findings and what we're learning with existing theory? And in this case, again, going back to that case of these counterfactuals, we can look at these other types of settings, and we're referring to markets here, but I'm using these firms as illustrations. But you know, were they classified differently in these other cases from what the online grocers were doing? Are there differences that matter in terms of the reliance on these actors on capital markets, the infrastructure requirements, you know, the competitive dynamics of the firms within these spaces? Do they look different when we look across outside our case to these that actually were successful? Different efforts to establish the collective identity of the market and the roles of incumbent firms in these spaces. And we use these really at the end and the back end of the paper, more in the discussion and the developing the general framework to build on our case evidence to provide something that is hopefully more generalizable in some sense, but also is useful for guiding future research and questions to think about and advancing the space forward more. In a way, this is sort of my bias, I guess. I think of work like this as sort of like a theory paper plus, because it is theory building, theory development in a lot of ways, but it's grounded in rich and I think cognitively accessible evidence. You know, the reader of it can really think about this and understand what happened. Hopefully it's transparent. They can see the evidence and in some sense come to their own conclusion for what's going on if done well. And it's designed really with the purpose of elaborating and extending existing theory. So that's my project. I'm trying to be a bit mindful of time here, talking quickly. The tips and tricks that I was asked to speak to, one is how do you ensure comprehensiveness of qualitative data collection? And you know, grounding this in just what I talked about, there's this question of, for your research question, this all, in my view, relates back to your research question, which can very well and will often morph over time, right, as you get into this process. But what types are essential? So for us, we're interested in contestation. So what types of actors do we need to gather good data on? What sources are sensible to capture the perspectives of those actors? So we looked at PR Newswire, Supermarket News, you know, Thompson for Analyst Reports, et cetera. Is that really representative of the types of actors that we're interested in? What sample is manageable? You can't analyze everything, and at some point it becomes a bit overbearing. But also what sample is sufficient? At what point do you reach this, you know, this theoretical saturation where new data is really not telling us something new? And as you go through that process, you might discover what you're interested in question-wise is really not as interesting, or there's these other elements that are interesting, and you shift and kind of go through the cycle again. Another question was on the impact of COVID-19 and social distancing on this process. So for me, I might not be the best person to answer this because my archival data is less affected by it. But as you think about it, I think it raises a lot of interesting possibilities for many different kinds of qualitative research. Thinking about us right now on Zoom, right? These recordings are increasingly accessible and acceptable to use for people, and analysis ready, right? We're gonna have a recorded video of this and transcription that's sent to us afterwards, I don't know if you actually are or not in this case doing that, but recording it. But if so, that's a great source of qualitative data, and that fact that people are more comfortable and used to using this, I suspect it will be easier to reach out to people, depending on the nature of the study that you're doing, to set up a Zoom conversation to interview subjects for a qualitative study. I'm going to skip my SBDC anecdote and application. This can be challenging for studies that require more in-depth participant observation. If you require a real understanding of the emotions and sort of the facial expressions with how people are interacting in a space, if that's what you're investigating, this can be really challenging. And I'll leave it to others, I guess, to provide guidance on how you manage that. But I guess the thing I will leave you with is this can be a really interesting theoretical lever in ongoing studies. So if you're in the midst of a qualitative study right now, or you were, and this thing happened and things change, it can be a great challenge, but it also might be a great opportunity to take, you know, what you had before as a pre-test in some sense and understand how this affected change. And it maybe you need to go back and adjust, or maybe you might benefit from going back and adjusting your research questions slightly to inform something better than you might have thought you could even going into it. Last thing I was asked to speak to is establishing validity and reliability in qualitative data. Great question, really important. For me, I find it easiest to think about this in terms of, and I think there's a question about this, the ensuring the trustworthiness, rigor, and quality of the research process. Ultimately, I think this comes back to eliminating as much as we can, you know, bias. Certainly we want room for our interpretations, right? That's what this was about. It's, but we don't want to be overly biased. We want to provide a good understanding of a situation that's otherwise really difficult and confusing to understand, and ultimately provide confidence in our interpretations. And so in my view, some of the key factors in this is being transparent in both the process and the data that you're presenting as evidence that you're deriving your inferences and your interpretations from. And triangulation can help. And this is just to illustrate that triangulation can come in a lot of different forms. In terms of, you know, who and how many people code the data and in what way. It may be the case you want to randomize, you know, when different coders see the data. As Bruce mentioned, he has a person that was actually, you know, outside of the setting itself intentionally to provide some additional reliability, to take away potential bias, right, and from the process. You might triangulate, you know, our different stakeholders in the type of, in our case, different. Are all the entrepreneurial firms the same, or are there important differences? So we want to triangulate across and within and across different stakeholder types, different methods to support the story and to inform it. And a lot of these sort of later things to the right of the slide are around how do we really best inform our interpretation of what's going on? You know, can we think about this at different levels of analysis, and how do these things inform each other? It was the Kari and Wadhwani paper we just read recently on Indian art in a seminar. It informed my thinking in that in a way, because they very intentional about understanding how the broader context, cultural context, informs the dynamics that you're interested in. I think it's an important piece of it. And then again, the Weber et al. Grass-fed meat paper, if you're familiar with that, also incorporates counterfactuals at the end, which is, I think, a relatively rare, but I think a nice thing to do to really enhance the robustness, I guess, of our findings. So I will leave with that. Oops.
Thanks a lot, Chad, for some absolutely fabulous kind of insights on this ongoing process.
Yeah, too ongoing.
And but yeah, like a process, qualitative research is also a process, but hopefully we get some outcomes over a period of time. But having said that, and those outcomes are always, you know, I think wonderful outcomes. So having said that, let's move on to Renee.
There you go.
Renee, do you want to take it away?
Yes. Ignore the quantitative data that you see there. Okay. Do you see my slides?
Yes.
All right. So thank you again to the presenter, or to the panelists, for making this happen. And thank you to the participants. There's some nice conversations going on in the sidebar. What I wanted to do was answer the question, I'm sorry, that was posed by the panelists. How do you organize this mess of data? And how do you take the leap from what you found to creating a story that is coherent, let alone persuasive? And I don't know that I'm necessarily the best person to answer this. I'm going to present to you some tips that have helped me think through this, and also 3 papers that are still being developed, just like Chad's. And first, I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you. The first is, these are the 4 takeaways. There's a way to get out of the woods, which is tip number 1. I'll talk about that. And then I'm going to introduce 3 authors that maybe some of you have heard about, maybe some of you haven't, and I'll provide some links to a couple of their documents that have helped me think through what it is we're trying to do with qualitative research. My area of interest is mostly in the context of innovation and entrepreneurship. I don't really care about people. I don't even care about the business. I care about like what's the context that shapes their behaviors and their strategic opportunities. And so for me, the qualitative data allows me to get a bigger picture, just like Chad was saying. Let me just go through these. So the people I'm going to introduce you to is a fellow named John McPhee, who's actually an investigative reporter, if you will, creative nonfiction writer. He's won some Pulitzers, he used to work for the New Yorker, and he talks a lot about thinking about the shape of a story. Johnny Saldana is a professor of theater, maybe retired now, at the University of Arizona, and he's helped write one of the SAGE books on qualitative methods, actually a couple. But what I found was a document where he's used it to help theater therapy, trying to understand the life histories of some of his students. And then Ann Huff, who has written a book on the academic conversation, thinking about what conversation you're in, and both of the other presenters have used terms that are straight from her work. So the first piece is you're working on your qualitative data, you're getting bogged down, you've got all this either archival material or interviews. What do you do to sort of get out of that issue? For me, it's always been trust your data, go back to the thing that surprised you. So for instance, in this first project I'm going to talk about, we thought we were studying an Indian microfinance organization of fishing villagers in South India. And one of the people who led the group said, no, just having a good co-op, just giving loans, you're nowhere if the resource is situated at sea. We go beyond what is conventionally done by a co-op. And so all my categories, NGO, co-op, microfinance, none of this really mattered or made much sense when you think about people who rely on a resource that they have no control over and that moves around. No state boundaries really dictate it. So fishing really forced us to reconsider what we were looking at. So, oh, I'm sorry, I'm looking at my advanced slide. So this was some of the photos from our setting. And, you know, they're fairly poor, bottom pyramid, very rudimentary sort of economic activities. Their boats, in some cases, are just big logs that they've carved out. And yet they were doing things like coming up with designs to rebuild after the tsunami. And the picture that I'm showing here is actually a architectural drawing that this group of fishing co-op, whatever they are, came up with. And these houses were way more successful after people moved back into them. So what's going on here? Turns out there's this series of activities this group is engaged in. It's a very holistic kind of way of organizing. And we were forced to go drop our quantitative data and go look at interviews, ethnographies from other fields, public policy documents. And then one thing that we've done is plotted where we actually did our research. So let's see if my mouse shows it. Oops. We have our sites that we visited, which are the black dots, but then we found all these ethnographies that other people had written about fishing villagers in this also South Asian Indian context. And we used those ethnographic accounts of other people to help enrich our own understanding and some of the quotes. From all of that, you know, then you come up with your table and you start to organize it. But I wanted to give you a sense of there's a question or a quote that sends you into a much richer place to investigate. We're still trying to get that published. Second piece is data structure. I did a dissertation on a NASA telescope. So here's your obligatory space photo. This is actually from the telescope that I studied. It's an infrared telescope called Spitzer. And when I was talking with them, they had just, the telescope was already working and the telescope had gone offline for some glitch. And I was talking with the lead scientist and I said, hey, I hope Spitzer gets back to normal. And he said, normal is not a term we use on Spitzer. And I was like, okay. So I realized, you know, This is a technology that had never been built before, studying an area of science that was brand new and a region of space that was invisible. How are they doing this? I realized my questions that I originally started with, which was interviews, was never going to cut it. The group is made up of 1,000 different people from about 24 different organizations. And I realized I needed to better understand the whole project, not just when this particular group of individuals started working on it, but I had to go back to like when NASA started at the end of World War II. So maybe what I need to do is follow the project instead of the people. But I didn't know how to do this. So I found more data. I gathered white papers and diaries of the scientists, academic publications, etc. But I still didn't know how to organize it. And that's where I came across the work of Johnny Saldana. And he has this, I've listed 4 books down here that are now Sage Press management style research methods. For those of you who are looking alternatives to Yin and Eisenhardt's work, highly recommend. And Saldana had created a structure so that as you follow the life history of, say, a teenager, you can ask what happened when they were 10, what happened when they were 12, what happened when they were 15, what stayed the same. Maybe they continued to be active in sports. What changed? Maybe their parents got divorced. What's cumulative? They got better at computer skills. What's idiosyncratic? Maybe when they're 15, they got a driver's license or their first job. And you compare this to each period before and after, and you develop also a through line to understand what is really the story of this person's life. And I used this technique, here's my spreadsheet, for unpacking the stages of this project. From this, I noticed there were some critical events, and this project kept losing legitimacy, often through things that had nothing to do with the project itself. And this loss of control really turned out to be the sort of the key issue for this project before they became successful. When they started realizing and acting on these invisible forces, the project started to come together. And that was sort of my insight. Third tip is the shape of the story. And in a history, you often have the opportunity to just say on day 1, this happened, on day 2, this happened. And that's what we did here in this book on the history of the Space Telescope. But in the quant papers, you've got a structure that's given to you. Here's a table. You know exactly what's supposed to happen. Also working on getting that published. That's what the other screen was. And then with qualitative stuff, though, you have to figure out the arc of the story. And in literature, this is a guy named Gustav Freytag created this, the triangle, the dynamic triangle, or the narrative arc. There, you set the stage, there's some sort of problem, there's some sort of turning point, you conclude it, and everybody lives happily forever after. Kurt Vonnegut in this chalkboard drawing also has a bunch of arcs of classic stories. Boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy wins girl back, Cinderella sees a moment of hope, loses it, everything turns out great at the end. The one I want to tell you, though, about is John McPhee. So he's the man who wrote this book, which is Annals of the Former World. It's 4 different major chapters, each on a different segment of American geography. And what he did is he basically did an ethnography of geologists and to understand how the country came together. Like, we're talking about like dirt and rocks. And that sounds like a really boring kind of story, but it won the Pulitzer Prize. And what's interesting about it is he has this notion that every story has a shape. And in the case of this story, how do you organize the whole geographical history of not just a country, but a chunk of rock? And he followed this line across the United States. So he started near Long Island, and it's basically the Highway 80 that comes across. And he just interviewed people along that route. And he also structured the geological processes along that route. The oldest part of the country is on the East Coast. The youngest part of the country, in terms of dirt and rocks, is on the West Coast. And so it created a path through all the data. Think that way. You can have a circle, you can have zigzags. There's all sorts of ways to move through the data, but McPhee has some thoughts about this. So let me give you one last example. Let me check the time, we're almost out. Just show you how it comes all together. So we were working on a paper on understanding modern cannabis dispensaries, and we realized that we needed to understand the history. One of our investigative participants said, hey, the reason we wanted to create these new companies, we wanted people to know that cannabis was this big part of our history. George Washington, former president, grew cannabis and nobody knew. It seemed crazy. And we thought if people knew this history, then legalization wouldn't seem so radical, and maybe prohibition wouldn't seem so natural. And we realized there was this history that was missing. So we went back and looked for it. Sure enough, George Washington had grown hemp. And sure enough, people in this case, Brooklyn, New York, they were literally ripping it out of the ground so that people wouldn't have access to it. This is hemp. And so we were trying to understand, how do you tell a story where the data have been erased, that these normal understandings were gone? And we realized there were three threads. There was three words that people were using to describe this: cannabis, hemp, and marijuana. And we could tell the story of prohibition in a linear way, or we could tell the story in terms of its markets: cannabis, hemp, and marijuana. And here's where some quant data comes in. We did a text analysis, and we could see that the words that people were using were changing dramatically after this one tax act that basically set up the prohibition of cannabis in 1937 in the United States. And you can see it in the textual data. I then used sort of a blend of Johnny Saldana's idea, where what was there, what was missing, how did this change over time? And I looked at these three different markets and plotted when did the laws come in that made it illegal, what laws were coming in that made it legal, what medical uses were making it good, what medical uses were making it bad. And that's how we sort of came up to this idea that there's this process going on where they're actually erasing the institution. And that's what that paper's about. Last tip, this will go quickly. This is something both the other presenters talked about. What's your audience? This is where Ann Huff comes in. You know, who cares about your findings? Who are you talking to? And what ideas are you pushing back on or reshaping? And what I do, and this was kind of creepy, is I will actually take a photo of the people whose key papers I'm trying to address, and I will tape it to the top of my screen. I saw Ann Huff at a Starbucks one day, and I had told her about this, and she was delighted, but also a little bit like disturbed that I would do this. But it helps me stay connected to the audience that I'm trying to talk to. And this is a copy of her book, as you can see there. And I'll wrap it up with this, which is that this is a picture of taken by a 19-year-old Army photographer during World War II. And it turns out this Bedouin had come in from the desert, and this group had gathered, and everybody was enthralled with his story. And you know, the Army captain assumed that they were talking about the war because it was the most important thing in his mind. No, what it actually was talking about is that he had gone into the desert, he had seen something in far distance, he'd walked over there, found a dead twig, which meant that it had rained there 7 years before. And when he told this story, the group erupted in a hurrah, because for them, water is the most important thing. The war is irrelevant to them. And so the point here is you have to be aware of who your audience is, who cares, how are you going to tell the story so it's meaningful to them. And those are the 4 tips. And then the reason you take on these risks is what Sanjay said, is the payoff is really great. You know, in the case of the telescope, they worked on it for 30 years and it's either going to work or it's going to blow up. And either way, it was going to be a hell of a ride. Okay, that's it. Let me get out of my slides. Okay.
Well, those are some really excellent presentations. I think now we're going to move into the question and answer period.
If we could take like 1 or 2 questions. I believe there's 2 questions in the Q&A section here. I can ask but we should wrap it up within the next 2 or 3 minutes to start our next session starting in the next 5 minutes. I can ask 1 question here. How can we effectively recruit entrepreneurs and motivate them to keep staying in long-term qualitative research projects, especially if young scholars don't have an expansive network with entrepreneurs yet?
Can I jump in on that one?
Yes, please.
Because I've actually spent a lot of time working with this. One of the things I find is that the entrepreneurial community does not automatically respect the questions we're interested in, and they don't always assume that we have the same perspective that they do. And so what I've found is that when you're just going to them with an ask, will you participate in this study? It's hard to get them interested in giving their time to that. Whereas if instead, what's worked for me is becoming actively involved in organizations within the entrepreneurial ecosystem where I become visible to these entrepreneurs and they learn my story and we develop a relationship, then they will give me their time at that point. So I find the indirect route for me has worked as a stronger method of recruiting entrepreneurs who will be participating in a long-term ongoing type of research study like our field site study.
All right, thank you. This will probably conclude this session. Please, to all the participants, thank you all the panelists, to all the participants. We'll be starting our next sessions within the next 5 minutes. If you guys want to head over there. And again, thank you to all the panelists for your time.
Good luck, everyone.
Thanks a lot,
Thank you.
all.
Yes,
We'll be in
great
touch.
session.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.